Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. A charity law report found that in 2023, 67% of all revenue going to Canadian charities comes from government. So, a potential change in government with new policies and mandates can cause significant uncertainty among many nonprofits about their future revenue streams, even some anxiety. Federally, the Liberal minority government has already faced multiple non confidence votes in Parliament, and more are expected. So, a snap election could happen at any time in the months prior to the required election in the fall of 2025. Provincially, the Ontario government is expected to call an election in the next 6 months, while BC and New Brunswick have just gone through elections that signal a major shift in political support in those provinces, and Saskatchewan is in the middle of an election as I record this interview. In the face of such uncertainty, what can Canadian nonprofits do to better prepare their organizations for a potential new government? Are there any steps that they can take now to insulate their operations and revenue streams from the turbulence of government uncertainty? To discuss these important issues, we're joined by Niti Bhotoia, a specialist in private philanthropy and securing seven-figure transformational gifts, and an executive and team coach with more than 20 years' experience at the community and national level. Welcome to the podcast, Niti.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure having you. I wonder if we could start by just looking at why it's important for organizations to really assess their current revenue sources. How can this help identify risk and opportunity, especially in these environments where you have many organizations dependent on government funding, and we're facing uncertainty in terms of the electoral process and a potential change in government?
Well, one important reason for organizations to assess their current revenue sources is to be prepared for external factors. We know there is a federal election coming, but there are other factors as well. The economy, advancements in technology, these are all factors that will have implications on our sector and factors that nonprofit leaders should really be considering. Generally speaking, when we look at assessing revenues for organizations in our sector, we look at bundling them in three different ways. We look at government funding, philanthropy, and earned revenue sources. And if for an organization a significant amount of funding is coming from one particular area, it's important that they really understand that, understand how to maintain and potentially grow. Or if it's too much revenue in one particular area, it may pose a risk. And then the question becomes, how can the organization mitigate that particular risk? Your revenue assessment will tell you a couple of things. It will tell you where you're doing well, and therefore where you have opportunity to grow. And it's also going to tell you where you may not be doing well, but there could be potential opportunity, a gateway to new sources of revenue, if you will.
And why should organizations consider the kind of diversification that you've talked about? Because I think that's where we're going in that answer. When it comes to government funding and mitigating the impacts of these election cycles and changes of government, and I guess it's not just a why, but how is really a critical element of that.
We know that 70% of the funding that charities receive come from government sources. So when there is a change in elected government, it means there's going to be a shift in policy and there will be a shift in funding priorities. And even small changes can have a significant impact on operations. This is where it really becomes imperative for nonprofit leaders to think beyond short-term funding cycles and consider the long-term sustainability of their organization. We know historically organizations that survive during times of extraordinary cuts in funding have a couple of things in common. They are able to innovate, but they also are able to rely on philanthropic revenue during lean times. And that allows them to come back after some time and continue to grow and survive and continue.
And what is required internally at an organization to really successfully start diversifying their funding? And I assume that what we're talking about in this instance is probably smaller sized organizations as opposed to the larger ones, which we assume already have all of that in hand. How do they start doing that?
Diversification of revenue does take time, particularly for smaller organizations. My recommendation is to start by including it in a strategic plan that has a 3 to 5 year runway. And it's important for small charities to set realistic goals and to ensure that you have included the budget and infrastructure that's going to be required to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. Too often, organizations may think that hiring a fundraiser will resolve their funding issues, but it does take a full sort of 12 months, and I would say 18 months before you begin to see the gains of having a fundraiser support the organization.
And I guess, I mean, are there things that have to happen internally? I mean, obviously they do an assessment of where their revenues are coming from. Is there certain sort of operational or strategic restructuring that has to occur within an organization, or a sort of a, I don't know, I'm thinking of like a come to God kind of moment where they have to look very seriously at how they've been operating up until this point to come to a better sort of perspective in coming up with a meaningful and effective fundraising strategy?
Yes, organizations can sometimes become blind to the opportunities and the risks. And it is incumbent upon the charity to really think about incremental growth. So if an organization is really in need of unrestricted funds, for example, that's an indication that it really needs to plan for revenue diversification. And again, my advice is to start where you have success and grow that particular stream. The other thing to keep in mind is as you grow your revenue sources, you're also going to have to grow your programming, because in order to meet your project or program deliverables to donors and funders, you're going to have to show the impact that you were able to make. And so it becomes very important for an organization to have good policies, financial reporting structures, governance. All of these things need to be in place for an organization to see to see growth. And oftentimes the barriers to organizational growth are the same barriers to fundraising.
That's really interesting. So you can't just think about the kind of investment you'll have to make to raise the funds. You also have to think about the investment of resources to also show impact of those funds once they're raised and put into programming. A really important aspect. I wonder if you could explain how organizations how they can find new and different sources of government funding. Is it is it possible or even strategic to pursue government funding from all jurisdictions, or at least all the jurisdictions that you are located in or provide services for? Or is it, what is the ideas that are best practices for addressing this kind of aspect in terms of how you would include that in your diversification strategy?
When we look at the diversification of revenue, we do look at diversity in terms of government funding, philanthropy, and earned revenue. But every organization has a very different revenue model. And it is not to say that an organization needs to have revenue sources in these three channels. Organizations should think about diversification within each revenue channel. So if you are doing well at receiving government funding, again, the easiest place to start is there to look at how you can diversify. And organizations can do research to look for government opportunities. So all levels of government will put out a call for proposals. These are very specific. They have an application deadline, very specific questions. And an organization needs to determine if they have an alignment with the funding priority that the government has put out. So this is one way to look at funding opportunities, but organizations can also create funding opportunities for themselves. And this approach could be for a pilot or a project or even a fee-for-service model, but this will require a government relations strategy. So unlike the other method where there is a call for proposals, there is no timeline on this. It is a matter of building appropriate relationships and moving through processes that will allow for the an eventual agreement of funding.
And so, what are some of the best practices for building those relationships or securing government funding, which is ultimately the goal? What should organizations be doing when submitting funding applications or taking the first steps to reach out to develop those relationships?
As I mentioned, I think the first step is to really ensure that your request is aligned with the government's priorities. You want to be able to frame your organization's work back to the government in a way that allows them to see that funding your project would allow them to reach their goals as well. I think that's very important. And another thing that seems very obvious but is often overlooked is to make sure that you meet the eligibility requirements for any application that you're putting in. These applications take a lot of time and they can be quite complex. And again, for smaller organizations, if it's a first time application, I recommend potentially getting some outside advice. You also want to make sure that your budget is realistic and that your deliverables are going to be realistic based on your internal capacity. So regardless of the funding envelope that may be available, you want to keep your request proportionate to the size of your organization's operating budget.
And I'm curious whether you think I've talked to some other experts that refer to the capacity to be able to work collectively or collaboratively with other organizations, especially if they're smaller. Is it helpful for organizations working on similar issues or causes to team up and partner on funding applications?
Working with partners to deliver a stronger project is seen favorably. So I highly recommend that if that is a possibility for an organization. But it's important to build and maintain these relationships throughout the year and not just when a funding opportunity arises, because there can be a lot of complexity and an understanding between organizations that needs to happen in order to be able to put forward a project jointly. This is also a great way for smaller organizations to think about the diversification of their revenue. So for a smaller organization that may not be able to take on a full application or be the lead applicant, embedding themselves in a larger application that a community partner is going for, it's a great way to build towards being able to get to a place where it can also begin applying for opportunities.
Yeah, I guess that builds credibility with the people that would be reviewing those applications and a track record, hopefully of success, that would allow them to begin to be more independent and potentially independently make applications that would have, the benefit of a good track record that behind them to support them.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain what's meant by money being left on the table and how organizations can identify What opportunities exist in this situation?
Leaving money on the table means that you have overlooked opportunities. And the best way to avoid this happening is to be proactive and to be rigorous in your approach to prospecting. Don't wait for opportunities to come, they very rarely do. Fundraising ultimately supports mission work. And in order to do mission work, funding is going to be required. And so I recognize that many nonprofit leaders have a passion to do a particular kind of work. And fundraising is not what they had in mind when they begin the journey. And so, but fundraising is so critical to the success of any organization that it should be considered alongside the programming innovations that are taking place.
And I wonder if we could wrap up by giving you an opportunity to provide advice for smaller organizations. A vast majority of the organizations in the nonprofit sector in Canada are smaller, especially those who may not have a large fundraising team. What what would you suggest that they do, how they start, and how to think of this as part of their, I guess, a major um, stream of their operations, really?
I would say that regardless of the size of your organization, there is always room and opportunity for growth. Smaller organizations should look beyond paid staff to senior volunteers, current and past board members, community leaders, and others to support fundraising. And I think that is an important place to start. And I would say begin with just three meetings. Those meetings are an opportunity for nonprofit leaders and board members and those who really care about a particular cause to take the work into the market and understand what is resonating. And often that will result in a refinement to programs and a refinement in the way that the cause and the issues are talked about. And in so doing, what happens over time and with continued fundraising activity and momentum, revenues will start to come in the door, which can then be used to support a fundraising position or fundraising infrastructure that is going to be required to continue to grow. The key again is to start small, start with three, and then try three more and see where the opportunities and ideas take you and to be open to them.
Well, thank you, Niti, for your keen insight and your terrific advice to nonprofits and charities across Canada. It's really so helpful as we navigate these uncertain times, where we're going through this rather unprecedented period of great government change. So I really appreciate your contribution to this discussion. Thanks for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.